ask me questions.
Okay, I will ask you questions. What's your name? Your name's Mark Barabald,
Yes.
and you're a great guy.
And
I
I'm
love
mad
it.
at you because you actually stripped the knob on the top a little bit. You
I
yanked
love
it
Mark.
instead of turning it.
All right.
All right.
And what are you looking at right there, Mark?
All right, this is your Charles, what's it,
Frodsham?
Frodsham watch. And
See, the people at home can see it.
yes, the serial's on the dial.
Right, and there's a little key that I bought at Leader's Jewelers.
It is a more modern case style with a knob like this one.
This is Mark's
This
watch.
is a 1890s Hamilton with a reproduction dial.
So mine's 1862, and yours is
And
1890.
the serial number. Does John interrupt everyone in the family?
Absolutely. I'm going to shut up now. I thought I was supposed to
No,
ask you
no, no,
questions.
you're supposed to
Go
ask me
ahead.
questions.
All right, go ahead.
The front should unscrew, which actually you have to do it to set my watch. Okay, the case appears to be gold, and you open it. There's a couple of curious things in it. One is that the serial number on the inside cover of the case matches the serial number on the dial, and we're going to see if it matches the serial number on the plate, the main plate. So it has some weird wording for me, which is warranted. I think it's warranted 20 years or warranted carat fine, 18 carat fine. Generally, in American watches, if you see warranted, you start to think that it's going to be gold filled, which has a statutory requirement of being at least 20% that carat gold, which spread over the entire case obviously cuts the carat down. The two holes here, one is for wind, one is for, I presume, set. There's a second case inside, and it'll pop right open. So I get there it is. All right, there's the second one, and you can see the plates. I think technically this is not the main plate, but that'll be the one underneath it. So then you'll see that on the watch that the plate actually has the same serial number as is on the case, and I believe the serial number is repeated on the inside of the back as well, along with a some sort of either a hallmark or a maker's mark, probably indicating it's 18 carat. It's rose gold. You can tell from the color it's slightly different. I'll put it next to a regular gold. You can see the regular gold is more the correct color of brass. So it's rose gold. Rose gold is usually not that horrific, ugly stuff that they sell in the stores now, which is pink. So on it has the maker's mark. It has the serial number. The serial number matches, and as you can see, it's running. That was my concern. It is the jewel markings may or may not be on it. I think John said that the manufacturer said that it was jeweled to the third wheel, which means the main wheel's not jeweled. But everything before that should be jeweled. That's not uncommon. This Omega I'm wearing does not have a jeweled main wheel because the main wheel turns so slowly they don't bother. On later watches or more expensive watches, they'll jewel the main wheel, and also they may or may not jewel the barrel, which is where the spring rides in it that drives the entire watch. These hopefully reddish stones, reddish circles like little donuts, that's a blued screw, isn't it? Yeah. All right. This does not have a lot of visible jewels, and I'm not sure how much of it is jeweled. This is probably a gear of some kind. It's not jeweled, but as John said, they said it was jeweled to the third wheel, so it should be jeweled at least partway through it. The end stone on the balance is that spinning wheel that has little screws in it, which have to be adjusted to make sure that it spins correctly. That wheel spins, and at the bottom there is some sort of either a peg or something that can move a second lever, and that lever, I believe, runs sideways on this one. And in between I was looking at it before the loop, I think, there you can see it. You can see it right over, there's a screw there, right around there, and underneath it you can see there's a little lever that moves back and forth, and that's part of the escapement mechanism. The escapement is what the balance drives it backwards and forwards, and, well, actually, it's not driven by the balance. And then you have the escape wheel, which is that very thin, sharp toothed wheel that is moving one time for every half revolution of the watch. That actually, the mainspring drives the gears and then ends up putting pressure on the escapement wheel, or the escape wheel, which then acts on the escapement, which then sends impulses to and from the balance to keep the balance moving. So the balance is driven by, ultimately, through the gear chain. Even today, when you buy a jeweled mechanical watch, even the one I'm wearing, which is, this one's probably 1955, but even on a more modern one, like my, well, that's an old movement, so I probably shouldn't use it as an example, but on my more modern ones, you will normally see that there's a donut-shaped, in other words, perforated jewel that a pivot goes through, and a pivot's kind of like the little end of a screwdriver, and then it goes back and forth. It spins through the donut,
Okay.
and then to reduce friction. Normally, there's a little bit drop of oil in that. The oil, through capillary action, kind of goes around the pivot, and that's enough to reduce the friction. But on the balance wheels, from what I understand, they add an end stone, and the end stone is so you have the donut, and you have a flat, literally flat on the bottom and domed on the top, capstone. And then what happens is the pivot goes through the donut and then doesn't touch the capstone wheel, but the capillary actually, the oil keeps it around the pivot and puts a little bit over the top of the pivot before it hits the end stone. So on, let's see, are there any other, this one has end stones, I think only on the balance. I have some watches that have, actually this does have end stones. Sometimes what they'll do is these are all, yeah. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll put not just donut perforated jewels, but when you get closer to where the escapement is and you have the spinning wheel, you can see that there are non-perforated jewels there and there. This one's for the escapement, for the escape wheel. This one's for the escapement that actually rides up against the action of a ruby that spins back and forth on the shaft of the balance wheel. I hope I'm saying that correctly, because I just haven't taken one of these apart in a while. So they do that to reduce friction. So these are the fastest moving parts. So they want to keep the friction as low as possible. So this moves the fastest. This moves a little bit slower. This moves a little bit slower. Then everything after that moves much slower because it's a gear reduction. Until eventually the main wheel will then turn. Well, there's two wheels. There's a main wheel that drives the hour hand, and then there's a gear comes off it, and it should be driving the minute hand, if I remember correctly. As I said, it's just been a while since I've taken one apart.
Sure.
I'd like to refresh my recollection on
Yeah,
that.
that's okay.
But basically, that's what it is.
How about the concept of the railroad watch that
So,
you were talking about
right.
before?
So this is the little key-driven thing to set the time. This one winds. There's a barrel in here. There's also a reference there to it being a Fusee watch, and this is kind of really cool. They did a couple things to make this so it was temperature insensitive and wind insensitive, because if you have a spring and you wind it up, it starts to pull harder and harder and harder.
Right.
So that's addressed in a different way with a more modern watch. But they did back then was they would use a Fusee, and a Fusee pen.
Pen?
A Fusee is a stepped, kind of like a stepped wheel. I'd call it a gear, but it's not, because there's a chain that wraps around it, and it goes in a spiral. And then as the watch winds down, as the chain comes off, then it goes to the movement. As it goes to drive the movement, as the watch winds down, and I may have done it backwards, it may come from the top down. As the watch winds down, the spring is exerting less pressure than the stepped function of it being like a spiral
It's a
gear
gear.
almost. Yeah, it's really a gear.
In
It's really a gear.
reverse. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
Same
It's-
pressure, but different pressure at the end.
It's a
result.
really cool solution.
Yeah.
And that's one of the cool things about these, and that's one of the reasons I'd be very hesitant to go ripping one of these apart,
Oh,
because
okay.
the chain it's made like hair. It's a miracle they were able to make some of the stuff. If you look at a screw that you take out of some cheap Timex and you look at it and it's stamped and it looks cheaply made, you take a screw out of a watch like this, which is smaller than that, obviously. You take a screw out of this and you look at it under a dissecting microscope at 20 or 30 power. It looks like a perfectly formed bolt the size of your finger.
So how could they manufacture that in 1862?
Amazing.
Like they had to do that by hand.
Yeah. It was just
my God.
if you look at think of the engineering they went into
Amazing.
making watches at that time compared to what they did to make trains, which
How
are
about,
much
like,
larger.
aviation?
Sometimes you wonder why that stuff is so much more crude.
Amazing.
So anyway, so there was some question about whether the plate had been polished. I think it was just dirty, so I don't think it was polished. There are some marks from use where the key has obviously been scratched over it by someone who is older, not paying attention, drunk. Not uncommon in things. And it's running, but it has what you'd call low amplitude.
It's a little fast,
If
I
you
think.
no, it's running fast because the wheel is spinning slow, which seems insane, but that's the way it works.
Okay.
If the wheel is spinning slowly, watches tend to run fast. Now this is a watch that I guess this is probably the first, maybe the third or fourth pocket watch I rebuilt. This one I must have done a good job because it's running with really, really excellent amplitude. This that means the balance wheel will spin around a minimum of 180 degrees to keep good time. So usually you aim
It's
for,
really not spinning, it's oscillating, correct?
it's oscillating. That's
Right,
correct.
because spinning means
You can
all
see
the
it on
way
this one
around.
more easily,
Right.
but it's oscillating. So
I don't mean to say not
there's a
spinning.
hairspring, which is a very, very thin spring, which you look at it, if I were to stop it, which not my favorite thing to do, but I don't like stopping a watch for no reason. All right, if we don't hit it again, you can see that there's going to be a hairspring, which is a very, very fine spring that is a very fine spiral. This one would be tough to stop because I just wound it. That's a good runner. But there's a hairspring, and that makes it so the balance wheel can turn one way and then turn back the other way.